And I'd like to introduce our guest speaker, Dimitri Lascaris. He began his legal career at Wall Street in the law firm of Sullivan and Cromwell. In 2004, Dimitri joined one of Canada's leading class action law firms, Cyanide LLP. Canadian Business Magazine described him as the fiercest legal advocate for shareholders' rights. In 2016, Dimitri retired from Cyanide and the practice of law in order to devote himself to activism and journalism. He is now a correspondent and board member of the Real News Network, and he is currently the justice critic in the shadow cabinet of the Green Party of Quebec. Please, I'm going to give the mic to Dimitri.
Thank you, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I played a very small role in this documentary. The person, one of the leading contributors to this was Robert Lang of Kensington Productions in Toronto, who happens to be the board chair of an organization called the Real News Network. Used to be based in Toronto, is now based in Baltimore. It's an independent media news organization. I highly recommend that you watch the Real News to get your news, because there you're going to find truly independent journalism. And that's how I came to know Bob. And in the course of my work as a class actions lawyer, I did a lot of litigation against mining companies in Canada and came to understand the extraordinarily nefarious role they play in our economy and corrupting the democracy of this country. And I think that this wonderful documentary that Bob has helped to make has really shed light on the role of the extractive sector, not only in our economy, but in the politics of this country. And I hope you'll find it as enlightening as I did. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering any questions you have after the documentary.
So, Dimitri, maybe we can start with you telling us a little bit more about your work as a class action lawyer, kind of coming head to head with these kind of mining companies, and maybe the challenges that are faced to bringing justice in these issues.
Well, class actions have helped us to deal with the fundamental problem in the economics of litigation, and that is particular individuals may not have sustained enough loss in order to make the prosecution of a claim economically sensible. Because litigating a claim, especially something like the Mount Poly disaster, involves quite a bit of expense. You have to hire experts who look into the causes of the the tailings pond bursting. You can't simply ask the company to pay the bill if there isn't any fault on the company's part, if there's no negligence in many cases. And so you have to establish causation, and that requires expert evidence, and that's very expensive. There are many other costs. Class actions actually aggregate the losses of all the people who have been adversely affected, and you are able to pursue in that claim in a single claim, you're able to pursue the claims of potentially thousands of persons, and it makes it economical for the claim to be pursued. But it still can be very expensive and very risky to pursue these cases, particularly in Canada, where you have what we call an adverse cost regime, and if you lose, so for example, if you fail to establish causation, between some causal connection between wrongdoing on the part of the defendant and the damages sustained by the plaintiffs, you could end up having to pay over $1 million in costs to the company. So it's very risky litigation, but class actions have ameliorated the problems to some degree. In the Mount Poly case, the firm that I used to work for, I'm now semi-retired, we did actually pursue a claim against Mount Poly, but it was on behalf of investors who lost a lot of money when the tailings pond burst and the company's stock price plummeted. Environmental claims in this country still remain very difficult to pursue on a class action basis, although there is some hope on the horizon.
Maybe you can help us kind of shed a bit more light, and specifically in the kind of ability to shape policy that kind of these mining companies have, and just to what extent is it? There's kind of a lot of, is it just with support and kind of whatever, and to what extent is it happening in Canada?
Well, the fundamental thing you need to understand about the mining industry can be summed up in one word, and that's externalities. It's a fancy economic term meaning simply that the costs of production are spread across innocent persons, people who don't gain anything from the production, and the profits are largely appropriated by the executives and the shareholders. And this is what makes mining, so profitable, including the gold mining industry. When you see these environmental disasters, who's paying for that? The public is paying for that. When you see these toxic tailings ponds that are left behind, and and the company's gone bankrupt, who's going to pay for that? The government, and therefore taxpayers, are going to pay for that. And so these businesses are highly profitable because the costs are foisted on all of us, but the profits are kept by executives and shareholders. And then those executives take the money that they've been able, or the profits they've been able to accumulate largely by foisting the cost of the production on us, and they use it to fund the political campaigns of people who are seeking public office. And they in turn will, and I think that the Mount Poly case is a really dramatic demonstration of this, will let them off the hook. I mean, as of 2018, no fines had been imposed upon Mount Poly after 4 years. The disaster happened in 2014. No charges had been laid, none. Not even charges having been laid. The British Columbia government ultimately decided not to pursue any charges. I understand there are still some charges potentially pending under the Federal Fisheries Act, so federal authorities may pursue the company for penalties that could be up to $12 million under the applicable laws, but $12 million is a drop in the bucket compared to what the environmental cost has been. The cleanup, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars potentially, perhaps in excess of $1 billion. So it's absolutely scandalous that not even criminal charges have been laid against the executives. And certainly no money that even reasonably approximates the losses that the public has sustained, that the damage to the environment is going to be recovered at this stage.
Maybe we can open it up and see if other, our audience would like to ask some questions.
Well, part of the problem, of course, is the one I've already identified, which is the connection between between campaign finance and the profits being reaped by people in the extractive sector, but also these industries in Canada do create a lot of employment, and for that reason, getting them to adopt technologies which are cleaner for the environment, potentially more costly, is difficult, because there's a perception that is going to ultimately affect the ability of these companies to employ people in our community. So that's an argument you constantly hear. If we impose costly regulations, if we force these companies to employ more costly technologies that are less damaging to the environment, there's going to be less employment. So that is an argument that ultimately becomes an impediment to the kinds of reforms we need in order to protect our environment. I agree with you. I completely agree. In the longer run, when people talk about the climate crisis, we often hear, well, we need jobs. We need jobs in this country. And Greenpeace once coined the phrase, well, there are no good jobs on the dead planet. And I think that's absolutely true. But people tend to think in the shorter term, how am I going to, and it's understandable, how am I going to feed my family tomorrow if I lose my job? They don't think 50, 100 years down the road what's going to be left for their children, their grandchildren, decades from now. And that's a dynamic that's very difficult to overcome. But these documentaries help us to educate the public about the true costs, and ultimately, I think this is an argument that can be won. I am aware of Barrick Gold. I've been involved in litigation involving Barrick Gold. Barrick Gold, as is mentioned in the documentary, is the largest gold mining company in the world. Peter Monk, who became one of the wealthiest Canadians largely as a result of his co-founding or founding of Barrick Gold and his leading of that company, became an immensely influential person in Canadian politics and business. And that is a company that has a quite sordid record of complicity in human rights violations around the world. For example, in Papua New Guinea. That's one case that I'm quite familiar with, although I wasn't involved in that case as a litigator. In a gold mine out in Papua New Guinea, A number of locals were abused. Dozens of women were raped by security at the mine. Subsequent to all of those horrors becoming known, the company entered into a very pathetic settlement program with women who had been victims of sexual assault, and these women were persuaded to sign releases for what was really a pittance without really understanding what they were giving up. And this is one example of what I'm aware of in terms of Barrick Gold's activities around the world, but that particular case I'm not. Human rights violations by Canadian mining companies are something that is little talked about in the Canadian press, but is something that's very well known to the plaintiffs' bar in the class actions community here in Canada. And recently, in fact, a very important case went up to the Supreme Court of Canada, not involving Barrick Gold, but involving another company called Nevsun. It's a gold mining company based in Vancouver, and this company was employing slave labor in Eritrea. That's right, slave labor in its only operating gold mine in that country, which is a deeply repressive state. In that case, a claim was brought in Canada on behalf of the persons who had been employed as slave laborers in Eritrea, and the company argued that this was a case that was more properly heard by the courts of Eritrea, where of course these people were not going to get any justice. And fortunately, both the BC Supreme Court and the BC Court of Appeal decided that this is a case that ought to be heard by Canadian courts. And that was appealed up to the Supreme Court of Canada, and we're waiting for a decision in that case. So those there are, when I say there's hope on the horizon, the Canadian courts are opening up very, very slowly to the idea that environmental depredations and human rights violations by Canadian gold mining companies in developing countries where there's a real absence of due process, that those claims can and should be heard in appropriate circumstances here in Canada. So unfortunately, I can't comment on that particular case, but I can say that Barrick is a company that has a very, very checkered history, and the way things are going, we're very hopeful that companies like Barrick will have to answer for their wrongdoing here in Canada, where there's a reasonable prospect of justice. I'm not aware of that case, I'm sorry. I can perhaps say something about, affecting demand. Again, documentaries like this are very important in terms of affecting demand for gold, because people begin to understand when they see these types of revelations, the true costs, particularly to people who are very vulnerable in the developing world, of the production of gold. But another way to affect the gold mining industry is to internalize the cost of its production. So when something like Mount Poly happens, the company is made to pay the full cost of the environmental damage. If that were to happen, if companies in the mining sector had to pay the full cost of their production, and if they were forced up front in order to ensure that they're able to pay, to put a reasonable amount on security with the regulatory authority, which is not happening, so that if they go bankrupt, there is going to be money there to pay for the cleanup costs of their production. If you internalize all of these costs, this is going to be a much less profitable business. Much less profitable. And you're going to see a lot less investment capital going into the gold mining industry. You're going to see a lot less mines being set up. I mean, this was one of the great points about this documentary, is how the best gold deposits have already been mined. And now they are going after these really flimsy deposits where you have to extract extraordinary amounts of ore in order to get very small amounts of gold. The only reason why that continues to be profitable is because the cost of that extraction and refinement are being borne by innocent members of the communities in which these operations are taking place, not by the companies themselves. If you internalize those costs, these types of deposits are no longer going to be economic to pursue. There's going to be a lot less production and therefore a lot less environmental damage. So the first question, I mean, at the governmental level, nothing, in my opinion, of any real worth is happening. The conservative government of Stephen Harper put in place this thing called voluntary corporate social responsibility, which is kind of like an oxymoron because, no corporation that I've ever known in the capitalist system is going to voluntarily be socially responsible. They're only socially responsible as a general matter when they're forced to do so by law enforcement authorities. And then the Trudeau government in the election started talking about, well, we're going to beef up this system that was put in place by Stephen Harper, and they came up with some kind of an ombudsperson, who really doesn't have any real power to impose any penalties. The ombudsperson can only exercise moral suasion by investigating and bringing to light wrongdoing by companies in the extractive sector, but can't impose any penalties whatsoever. So at the governmental level, federally and provincially, I don't think anything is really happening that is going to solve the problems of the mining sector. There are many wonderful NGOs who are really trying to not only shed light on what's happening, what the mining sector is doing to the environment and to vulnerable communities, but who are advocating very vigorously for a mandatory regime of compliance that's backed up by stiff penalties in cases of non-compliance, and one such organization is Mining Watch Canada. But there are a number of others that are operating. I strongly urge that you support these organizations. They're doing wonderful work, but they're extraordinarily outmatched in terms of their financial resources. If in fact these companies were forced to internalize the costs of their production, our economy would change. Our economy wouldn't be nearly as dependent. It could no longer be nearly as dependent upon extraction. But that's, in my view, a good thing, because in the long run, we're going to have a healthier environment. We're going to preserve the planet upon which our lives depend and the lives of our children and grandchildren depend. So I don't view that as a bad thing, but there will have to be a transition away from an extractive economy, which is essentially what we have in this country. We as Canadians have to decide that this is not the kind of economy we want to have. I'm very glad you raised that, because this is something that's not talked about nearly enough. The oil and gas industry in Alberta has created an environmental nightmare in that province. And the Alberta Energy Regulator has done two things. First of all, as you've indicated, the quantity of the deposits, the security deposits that it's extracted from the industry to date constitute a minute, tiny fraction of the cleanup costs of the oil and gas wells and the tar sands tailings ponds in Alberta. You mentioned the figure of 60 billion. In fact, recently there was a leak of an internal estimate by the Alberta Energy Regulator that the true cleanup costs are in the range of 250 billion. So approximately $250 billion. And there are many experts who feel that even that is an unrealistically low estimate of the true cleanup costs in Alberta. But if you take that as the correct estimate of the cleanup costs, you're talking about $250 billion of unfunded cleanup costs in the province of Alberta. These companies, by the time that mess has to be cleaned up, these companies will be long gone. And the people who extracted the profits will be, have secured them in other jurisdictions, tax havens. They'll be living in the high life somewhere else and will not be able to extract those funds. So, and also there was a recent audit done, a series of audits done of the Alberta Energy Regulator, which revealed that the organization, the management of the organization, was concealing extraordinary conflicts of interest and was engaging in activities that were designed to line the pockets of the senior executives of the regulator. And the head of the organization was forced to resign in disgrace a few months ago. This is an organization, the Alberta Energy Regulator. It's almost ridiculous to call it a regulator. It has been completely captured by the oil and gas industry. It is rife with conflicts of interest. It is completely devoid of transparency. And we as Canadians, it's not just Albertans, it's all of Canada. All Canadians across this country are going to have to foot the bill for the mess being created by that industry. And that's quite apart from the destabilization of the climate, for which the tar sands industry, the fossil fuels industry in Canada has been such an egregious contributor. We're just talking here about cleaning up the environment in Alberta. We as Canadians need to get upset, and we need to demand better from our government.
Thank you very much for a really great conversation, and I want to thank everyone for coming. Thank you and have a good night.